Yeah, thanks for being here bright and early for a very exciting session on galactic archaeology and galaxy evolution. We're going to be traveling all the way from our favorite galaxy, our home galaxy, all the way to quiescent galaxies at very high redshift, all jam-packed into one session. And so, yeah, kicking it off today, to begin with, we have Cassie Lochhaas, who's going to get us started by talking about the circumgalactic medium and how she's doing such amazing work simulating. So, take it away.
All right, thank you very much. Is this volume all right for everyone? Great. Okay, so thank you so much for having me here. Thank you to the organizers and the leads here. Very excited. I'm a brand new Hubble Fellow. I just started at the CFA across the street. But what I'm going to tell you about today is some of the work that I've been doing as a postdoc at Space Telescope Science Institute, where I was just before this, with all of my collaborators listed up there on the screen. So what I'm interested in is trying to understand the circumgalactic medium, and in particular, I'll be telling you about a little bit of accretion, which I'm focusing on recently, using simulations, much like the one that we're watching here. So this is a galaxy in the center that we can see slowly evolving over time. And we're looking at both the density structure in the sort of blue to yellow color bar, and also the temperature of that gas, which you can see coming out as sort of the fiery bursts of hot gas coming out from that central galaxy. So if you've never heard of the term circumgalactic medium before, it's really sort of the conduit between galaxies and the rest of the universe. It's generally defined as sort of outside of the galaxy's ISM and stars, but still within the halo virial radius, although there's some debate about that. It is multi-phase, meaning there's a lot of different temperatures of the gas and different ionization states of the gas that we see there. It's also very multi-structured. We have both small scale structures, small clumps that are flying around, and also sort of larger structures as well. And it is very dynamic. We can tell just from watching this movie that there's sort of a lot of motion in the gas happening there. But unfortunately, it is also very diffuse and difficult to observe. So the way that we typically observe the CGM is by looking towards a bright background light source, like a distant quasar, and taking a spectrum of that quasar to look for absorption along the line of sight as it passes through some foreground galaxy CGM. So as you can imagine, this is really just a one-dimensional view of any given galaxy's CGM. So it can make it very difficult to actually figure out what's going on here. So what I'm interested in are what is the role of a galaxy's surroundings, its CGM, in its evolution, and how can we develop physically motivated, physically intuitive models for this connection between galaxies and the CGM, and of course, connect them to observations. So I like to describe myself as a computational galaxy evolution theorist, which means I use simulations like this one that we've been watching here as tools to try to answer these types of questions by developing a conceptual understanding from first physics principles. So I also do a lot of analytic modeling as well. So one very sort of simple cartoon model that we have for the CGM is given by this review paper in 2017. It's this gorgeous cartoon that shows we have a galaxy disk way down here in the center. So most of the stars in the ISM are in this inner region here. And then we can have some accreting gas flowing in on streams, outflows coming out as sort of biconical outflows from that central disk. Perhaps some of that is recycling, falling back onto the galaxy. And then sort of in between all of that is a diffuse gas halo. So this is a very nice cartoon model, but I want to go another step further. I want to be able to include sort of all of the relevant and also nonlinear and sort of chaotic physics that goes into this system. So when I'm developing my models, I like to use the simulations to inform them. And the simulations that I use are called FOGGY. This stands for Figuring Out Gas and Galaxies in ENSO. ENSO is the name of the simulation code that is used here. And these are cosmological zoom-in simulations, which means we start with a large cosmological volume. We pick roughly 6 Milky Way mass galaxies, or halos really, and we re-simulate just those halos at a higher resolution. And the thing that makes FOGGY a little bit different from other cosmological zoom-in simulations is that we have a higher resolution, not just within the galaxy itself, but also everywhere within a 200 co-moving fill-parsec box centered on the galaxy, which means that we can get a lot of structure in both the density and the temperature that we're looking at here to pick out sort of the small clumps of cold clouds in the CGM and this multi-phase temperature structure. And we can get this even very far away from the galaxies, which is a little bit different from other simulations. So one of the things to keep in mind here, I'm going to, unfortunately, that's almost it for the beautiful movies. I'm now going to focus on just one image. So this is one of our foggy galaxies right at redshift 0, so right when the simulation completes. And this is a roughly Milky Way mass galaxy. What we're looking at here is temperature, and this is just a 2D slice through the middle of that galaxy. So I put a little box around the disk to orient us here. And I've also labeled the major and minor axes, if you can see that. And we can tell right away that the CGM kind of separates out into different regions. There are these very hot outflows in this particular sort of 2D slice, because it's not perfectly symmetric. It's really only coming out on one side that we can see here. And then we also have these cool inflows that are spiraling in onto that central galaxy. And then there's this warm halo gas that shows up as green here that sort of fills the rest of the space between the outflows and inflows. And it's important to note that this gas is actually not static. It's not participating in any bulk flows, but that doesn't mean that there isn't a lot of motion in that gas. We can see this a little bit if we look at the radial velocity, so the velocity either towards or away that central galaxy, where again we can see the outflows are very strongly moving away from that galaxy, shown in red, inflows very strongly moving towards that galaxy in blue. But even outside of the outflows and inflows that I've marked on here, there's still some pretty intricate sort of differences in the radial velocity here. And we can see that even more closely if I now switch to velocity dispersion. This is sort of a quick and dirty tracer for the amount of turbulence in the gas. We can see it very strongly within the outflow, not quite as much within the inflow, but there's still sort of a lot of turbulence, a lot of velocity dispersion everywhere. So this is actually quite important because this tells us that there is a lot of turbulence in the CGM gas. And this means there's a lot of kinetic energy in that turbulence that contributes to the entire energy of the system. And that this turbulence can also provide a turbulent pressure support in addition to the thermal pressure that is not really accounted for in a lot of models of the circumgalactic medium. So for example, one of the things that I worked on, this is a recent paper, is I asked this question of what supports the CGM gas against that inward pull of gravity? Why doesn't all this gas outside of the galaxy just collapse onto it? And usually it's thought that this is hydrostatic equilibrium. We expect that there's thermal gas pressure that provides an outward supporting force that holds up all of that gas and keeps it from collapsing inward. So what we're looking at this image here, this is actually the exact same image. I kept that little box there because it's getting pretty hard to tell where our galaxy is at this point. But this blue color is telling us where all of the thermal pressure is providing that outward supporting force that is holding up that gas against gravity. But we can also start including some other supporting forces as well. We can include a turbulent pressure in green, which we can see is very strong, very close to that galaxy, and also especially within that outflow region that came out this way as well. If you remember, that had a very high velocity dispersion, a lot of turbulence there. And we can also include a rotational support. So a large part of the circumgalactic medium close to the galaxy is rotating, and that provides some additional support against gravity as well. So what I found in this paper is that it's really not hydrostatic equilibrium that is just holding up this gas. So it's, what is commonly assumed turns out to not be the case. It's not enough. We also need the turbulent pressure support and also rotational support to keep that CGM from collapsing in on itself. So now if we're thinking about how fresh gas flows are going to try to reach the galaxy to fuel further star formation, allow that galaxy to grow, they need to push through this very dynamic CGM somehow. And that could have some sort of interesting effects on those fresh gas flows. So this is what I'm starting to work on now. This is very preliminary work. This is showing, again, the same galaxy, but now we're looking at sort of a nice volume rendering here. We can see the galaxy disk in the center here. And then what we're looking at is only the inflowing gas. So all of the outflows, all of the sort of diffuse gas that's not really participating in bulk flows, that's not being rendered here. This is only the inflowing gas. And it's color-coded by its temperature as well. So we can tell sort of right away that we have these very large coherent filamentary structures that start out fairly cool, and they're actually connected all the way back out to the cosmic web as well, if I had rendered this out even further. So they start out very cool, but they sort of warm up a little bit as they travel through the CGM as they start approaching the galaxy. They're inflowing at roughly the free fall velocity for this halo, and they form these sort of nice coherent streams. But you'll notice if you look really closely that a lot of these don't really seem to make it all the way onto the galaxy disk. Like this one seems like it's sort of stopping before it gets there, and some of these out here are dissipating quite far away from that central galaxy. So this is a little bit contrary to what is normally thought about for filamentary accretion. Normally, we think that these inflows should just connect straight onto the galaxy disk, and that doesn't really seem to be the case here. And we can see this much more closely as well, or much more clearly, if we take sort of an all-sky view, where we have pretend we're sitting in the center of that simulated galaxy and just looking out, and again, only looking at the inflowing gas, and again, color-coded by its temperature. So this is a video, and I play this, what we're going to do is start stepping inward in radius, closer and closer to the galaxy, and we can see how these inflowing structures change. So as I start here, what we can tell is that we have these sort of cool cores in the centers of these filaments with warmer sheets surrounding them. And this may potentially be what's called a turbulent radiative mixing layer, where this shear from the inflowing filaments sort of mixes with the surrounding material. But as we get very close to the central galaxy, you can tell that these filaments really break apart and dissipate. I'm actually going to play this one more time so we can see it again. But where that really starts to happen is at about 50 or 60 kiloparsecs away from that central galaxy. So this is still pretty far away from that galaxy that these filaments seem to be sort of falling apart. So what I'm currently in the process of trying to figure out here is sort of, why is this happening? We don't really fully understand this. So it could be that the filaments are sort of just being heated up as they move through the CGM. It could be that they are sort of mixing with the other surrounding gas there. Perhaps a lot of that turbulence within the CGM gas is providing a lot of that mixing, or maybe they're even just being blown away by the outflows. So still in the process of figuring that out. But in the meantime, I can tell you some of the properties of these filaments. So these are all going to be sort of radial profile plots, where the galaxy itself is way down here at 0. And all of these filamentary structures that we're looking at here are generally moving inward. So in purple, I've shown sort of the cores of those filaments that we can see are much cooler. We also have the sheath of the filament in green, and then the sort of the rest of the CGM, all of the outflows and the gas that's not participating in these bulk flows as that orange dashed line. So we can tell that the cores are much cooler than the sheath, but even sort of the edges of these filaments in green is still a little bit cooler than all of the rest of the CGM. If we look at the metallicity of these, we can tell that these filamentary streams are quite pristine. They're very metal poor. However, the sheath region is a little bit more metal enriched, and this could be one of the clues that there's sort of some mixing that's happening in that layer sort of on the edges of the filaments. If we look at the covering area, or the covering fraction on the sky, so this is again pretending that we're sitting in that central galaxy and looking outward, we can see that the very cool cores, these metal poor cores of these filaments, have a very small covering fraction, only about 10%. So they really don't take up very much of the sky at all, whereas the sort of sheath regions surrounding those filaments do take up a good chunk of the sky. And then finally, we also look at their radial velocity. We can see that these sort of the cores of these filaments are moving very fast. They're almost at the free fall velocity, which is given by that black dashed line along the bottom there, whereas the sheaths are a little bit slower. So to sort of summarize all of that, we have the cores of the filaments that are very cool, they're metal poor, they're fast, they're flowing inward at a very fast pace, and they're quite thin, they're small in the sky, whereas the sheaths are a little bit warmer, a little bit more metal enriched, a little bit slower as well, and also take up more space. So of course, you can ask the question like, well, then how is this gas getting onto the galaxy? These filaments are somehow being dissipated, potentially by this dynamic CGM. So how does this gas actually travel all the way to the galaxy disk? And I don't have an answer for you yet. Stay tuned. This is what I'm planning on doing next. So potentially you'll hear about this next year. So I think I will just summarize here by saying that the CGM it's very dynamic. There's a lot of turbulence in that gas that provides dynamic support that keeps the CGM from being just a simple hydrostatic equilibrium like is normally assumed. And we can see that in the velocity dispersion and also in the forces that balance gravity. And then fresh gas inflows from the IGM have to push through this dynamic CGM, and that has some important consequences for those flows that seem to be dissipated as they do that. So I'll leave it there and take questions.
This is amazing, thank you. So you focused on the Milky Way. I was just curious if you have plans to look at dwarfs or more massive halos in this context?
Yeah, great question. I would really love to. Unfortunately, these simulations are very expensive. The 6 Milky Way mass galaxies that we have now have been running for like 3 years, and only 5 of them have got to redshift 0. So it's very expensive to do these types of Zoom simulations. So as much as I would really love to look at the different masses, it can be tricky. It's a little bit easier to look at dwarf scale because those are less massive and they go a little bit faster. But probably more massive than Milky Way is not something we'll be able to do.
Have you looked at the other Milky Way galaxies of the ones that have finished? Does this happen for all of them or just
Yes,
one?
yeah. So I was just showing one as an example here, but most of these trends do hold for the other ones as well. Yeah.
One last question while Arianna said that.
This is amazing. Most of the results you showed right at redshift 0, but does the behavior change at high redshifts where things are more desolate?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's something I'm actively working on right now, so I don't have an answer just yet. But yes, that will be part of this project once I'm done with it.
Well, let's thank Cassie for next up, we have Arianna, who will be telling us about some very special galaxies seen by the university in the first 2 billion years of the universe. So please take it away.
Thank you, Rohan. Can you all hear me? Everybody hear me? Great. Good morning. Hi, everybody. My name is Arianna Long. I'm currently a Hubble Fellow at UT Austin. Next year, I'll be starting as faculty at University of Washington in Seattle. I'm very excited and grateful for all the opportunities in this program. Last time I was here last year or in Baltimore, I talked to you a little bit about dusty galaxies and the relationship between dusty galaxies at high redshift with quiescent galaxies. Today, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the quiescent galaxies. Unfortunately, due to data reduction issues, we're just going to talk about some stuff in Sears right now, not anything else. My goal for today, by the way, we're going to talk mostly about why quiescent galaxies are really interesting. My hope is that those of you not in this field are somewhat intrigued by these objects by the end of this talk, and therefore give us all the telescope time.
Yeah.
Okay, so in our local universe, most or over half of all stars are locked up inside massive elliptical galaxies. Hierarchical merging, so when galaxies merge together to become larger, dictates that theoretically these should be the youngest galaxies, these most massive galaxies. But in fact, when we follow up on these objects and study their spectroscopic properties, we find that they're quite old, in fact, billions of years old. And when we push back in higher redshift, we continually find these quenched objects out to redshift roughly 2. So as early as 10 billion years into the universe, and now we know soon, even earlier because of JWST. And so these detections at high redshift are not anomalies. These are actually significant populations of these quenched massive galaxies. What I'm showing here is a number density plot. So on the bottom is the redshift, and on the y-axis is essentially if you take a megaparsec cube volume at different redshifts and count up how many massive quiescent galaxies, that's what you're seeing here. And so while there is a decline at higher redshifts, this population is still significant enough for us to detect them in significant numbers. When we look into our cosmological simulations to try to understand how these form so quickly and then die so quickly, we can't quite reproduce them, at least not in sufficient numbers. Each simulation has its own issues. Maybe it creates too many later on, maybe it creates not enough early on. But in general, we're struggling to understand the key physics, not only to quench these galaxies, but also just to build them in the first place. I want to call attention very briefly to the redshift range that I'm talking about and why it's really important and exciting to me. We know that a lot of simulations do start to fail around redshift 3, so about 2 billion years into the universe. Essentially, this period of time to me from an observing standpoint is really interesting because we have this factor of 10 in population growth between redshift 3 and 6 in this group of galaxies. Now, redshift 3 to 6, you might be saying, Arianna, that's a really wide range, but when we think about time, which is what redshift traces, this is about 1 billion years. With a factor of 10 growth in this population over the course of 1 billion years, we do not see that growth again for another 2 billion years. And so if you're going to try to capture how these galaxies grow really quickly, but also more importantly, in my opinion, at least for the sake of this talk, how they quench, this is the time period that we want to be looking at, just after the epoch of reionization, just before cosmic noon. There are a few hurdles or areas of investigation that need to be kind of addressed. And this is kind of my why should you care slide for those of you not in this field. So the first is understanding the role of dark matter halo formation and how that drives and how that links with galaxy evolution. So in order for these objects to exist at all, there have to be sufficiently large dark matter halos for them to reside in. Therefore, if we have different ideas on what a dark matter halo or how dark matter coalesces into halos early in the universe, let's say we're thinking about a heavier dark matter particle, halos will form faster, and these large halos will exist for these objects. So this has implications for large-scale structure and dark matter halo formation. Dark matter halos also, we know dark matter halo assembly kind of coincides with cold gas accretion onto the halo. So that's very important for driving gas into galaxies. And then there's also mechanisms, some exotic mechanisms, if you will, where dark matter halos may play a role in actually quenching the galaxy itself, even at these high redshifts. The next item is to understand extreme baryonic conversion rates. So if you've been paying attention at all to some of the ultra high redshift results coming out in JWST, you'll know that we're finding all these really massive galaxies that have gas to stellar conversion rates of something on the order of 20%, 30%, which is incredibly efficient. And so these galaxies are likely some of the descendants of those early massive star-forming galaxies. And so understanding how we can convert gas into stars at rapid pace to create some of the most massive galaxies in the universe, even this early on, is going to be critical to understanding these galaxies. And then on the other end of their evolutionary pathway, we don't actually really know what quenches them. We have a lot of ideas, AGN being a large one, but still there's not a lot of actual observed proof of this, just a couple of little random anecdotal cases. So we need kind of statistical investigations on not just AGN, but also other mechanisms that may drive gas out of the galaxy, like supernovae and stellar feedback. And then again, I mentioned some like more exotic forms of quenching. I think even if they are more exotic, they're worthy of investigating, at least at this point when we still aren't quite sure. And the topic of the rest of this talk today will be focusing on point 4, which is refining object detection and selection for high redshift quiescent galaxies. So most of what we've done to find these galaxies at high redshift is to take what we know about them at low redshift and apply it at high redshift. And it's not quite one-to-one for a myriad of reasons. Many of them mostly pertaining to just simply the fact that there hasn't been enough time for these high redshift quenched or quiescent galaxies to age and look like the galaxies we see locally today. So the galaxies we see locally today are quite red and quite old. And when we push back in time, even if these are their ancestors, even if they are a comparable population, their stellar population is still relatively young. So there's actually some blue light available in these galaxies, and that could sometimes bump them out of selection wedges and things like that, and rule them out. So up to about 70% of high redshift quiescent galaxies, depending on the method and depending on the paper and the sample and all that, up to about 70% can be missed in these searches. So it's really important when we have rare objects that we look for methods that focus on completeness and having large samples. Some other hurdles to overcome include just the fact that they're faint and high redshift. So they peak usually in the rest frame optical because again, their stellar population is dominated by older populations, even at high redshifts. And so they're just fainter. And there is a little bit of, not a little bit, depending on the method, there is quite a lot of contamination from galaxies whose stellar spectra are heavily reddened from dust. So dusty galaxies, which again, I mentioned we like those because they're probably related. But when you're trying to separate them out and disentangle some things, it can be difficult. There are lots of people other than myself, wonderful people who are working on trying to pioneer more methods to find these galaxies. I list a few here. Please check out their work. So for the sake of today, how am I doing on time? Sorry, yeah, okay, good. All right, I was maybe rushed through this, but okay. For the sake of today, I'm going to briefly go over some of the selection techniques that I focused on over the last year using JWST near-cam photometry to identify high redshift quiescent galaxies. And again, my goal was to kind of overcome some of the issues that previous low redshift techniques used to have a more complete sample. So essentially, I take spectroscopically confirmed quiescent galaxies at high redshift. I messed around with their photometry, making mock photometry in some near-cam bands, and identified this kind of wedge space where the majority of them appear to lie. These purple curves on the right are dusty galaxy templates that I've redshifted and moved around, and they appear to lie outside the wedge. And so I focus on these properties. If you have questions about them, please ask. And using that, I apply them on the Sears catalog, the Sears collaboration data, and I identify about 44, 45 quiescent galaxy candidates at high redshift. And the thing that I'm really thrilled about is that about a third of that sample is new. About 30 of those objects were identified using the kind of older methods that I had mentioned, including a little bit of machine learning. With my method, I was able to recover an additional 13 to 14 sources. And those 13 to 14 sources are a little bit younger. So more in the midst of their shutting down their star formation. So they may not be traditionally seen as quenched, but again, we're kind of bucking these definitions because we're trying to capture them as they're quenching. So I have some pictures. I do. Okay, great. So traditionally, these are not in the paper, so just don't take screenshots or anything, but just enjoy the imaging. So these are some snapshots of these objects. They are not spectroscopically confirmed. Some of them are, but not all of them. And essentially what we're seeing is just really compact morphologies, thank you, which is what we expect. Quiescent galaxies, especially at high redshift, are compact. There could be a few different reasons. It usually has to do with potentially different evolutionary pathways that are quite violent. So really starbursting, merging, things like that. But then we also see a little bit of a more diversity in shape here. And some of these are probably actually contaminants. So at the top here, you can see a point and then suddenly a disk pops up. So in my opinion, that's probably an obscured AGN. The second one and the third one in the longer wavelengths, you could see kind of some tidal features, maybe some nearby objects, some wisps. And so these might be mergers. They still could also be post-starbursty, quiescent, quenching galaxies, all one and the same. If quiescent galaxies are related to dusty galaxies, there should be a weird, awkward transition period between them where maybe they have both features. So there's some dust present, some warm dust, and maybe some awkward morphologies, but also some aged stellar populations and not a lot of recent star formation going on. So in terms of next steps, looking forward, because of the dusty contaminants and because I'm a dusty girl at heart, I PI'd a Cycle 10 ALMA program to follow up on about 600 sources in Cosmos Web to characterize their kind of dust properties, if they are contaminants or not. But also that same program plus another program will be used to actually actively identify high redshift dusty galaxies that could be related to these quiescent galaxies. So the second point is about the XMORA ALMA 2mm program. It's a blank field program to identify high redshift dusty galaxies. I don't have time to talk about why that's important today. Look out for Sinclair Manning's talk tomorrow. But essentially, there's also a lot of degeneracies and difficulties in finding these sources as well. So finding both populations will be really important to kind of understanding massive galaxy evolution at high redshift. And similarly for obscured AGN, I kind of showed you the image of how they can maybe be a contaminant, but also if we're going to test for AGN as being a potential quenching mechanism, we want to actually look for AGN in these galaxies, and they're likely to be obscured if we're going from the dusty galaxy down to the quiescent. So it's not going to be as straightforward as using an X-ray catalog or UV cutoff because of the dust attenuation. I'm going to go ahead and just leave my summary slide here. Thank you very much.
Questions? Well, I'll get mine in. So earlier you mentioned, thank you so much for such a lovely talk, so many beautiful images. Earlier you mentioned that there are some other exotic mechanisms potentially for quantum these galaxies other than, like the standard ADN. So I was curious, like what your favorite competitors were to
Yeah.
kind of like standard.
Yeah, the one I'm really interested in is halo shock heating. So when a halo is virialized, and I think we were just talking about this actually in the previous talk, and sometimes you have cold flows attempting to accrete onto the galaxy, perhaps it's shock heated by the halo itself. But the question is that these redshifts, are their halos virialized and hot enough to actually do that? And even if they're not, are we reaching a potential, at least at the center or closer to the galaxy, that is potentially dense enough and strong enough that you could start these kind of like shells of halo shock heating? Because it's not just it just suddenly turns on and it's filling the entire halo. It's believed to happen like in the shell format. And so that would look very weird. You would need kind of maybe some like creative SZ tests or something like that. Maybe some really, really fancy X-ray telescope. If you haven't figured it out yet, I am very much pro PRIMA and an X-ray probe. So this is very difficult. I feel like we need all of these things. But yeah, that's my favorite one that feels kind of out there.
Awesome. Thank you. I was just curious about X-ray coverage.
Yes.
Because, I mean, you could potentially identify AGN, even if it's dust obscured, I guess, at those redshifts, it would be hard X-rays you'd be looking at. And then also maybe you could see, extended emission from some of these very big halos.
Yeah, we are looking. One of my close collaborators is an X-ray AGN astronomer and an obscured AGN astronomer. And we've been talking about some of the thresholds for X-ray luminosity and things like that. And we are checking X-ray catalogs for these sources, but ultimately we need another round of a few, I think it's megaseconds over this field in order to really drill down on the obscured population at these redshifts. Yes.
Well, let's thank